used in data visualization as well. It's also called Whirly when it comes time to placing materials. But yeah, so we do Voronoi tessellation. That's the fancy term for it. I believe Houdini can do this out of the box. I'm not necessarily sure how to do this in Maya offhand, automatically. But regardless, you need to shadow the road up front. That's the take-home point. And here's an example of what it looked like in Maya, where we dragged the pole through, we figured out the trajectory, and then we pre-shadowed the mesh, and then we added some dynamics. Now, one of the things we did to make it quick is we constrained each chunk of the road to the particle that was at the center of it. And then we had forces push those particles around, but use the actual geometry of the road for the collision. So the forces applied to the particles, but we used the shape of it. And we had two force fields that did this. So the first, as we dragged the telephone pole, the first force field pushed out. So basically it would make the road explode a little bit. We had gravity naturally, so you can consider that a second force field. Then the third force field is, believe it or not, one that settles the road. What often happens when you run a rigid body system is things just explode everywhere. We just wanted it to bump up a little bit. So immediately, after they expand out, we kind of push them back together. So what you're going to see here is I'm going to drag those two fields first. Once the first field hits, we push the road away. Then the second field settles it back a little bit into shape. And we sort of drag that through. And once that's done, you essentially get the effect here. I'll lower that one. We've already seen it. So watch how it explodes, settles back, and naturally we're doing a lot of dust particles as well. So that's how an effect might be done on cars. Now, there's yet another kind of simulation we do. So we talked about a few kinds. We talked about cloth and air. We talked about effects for particles, fire, water. There's also crowd simulation, where you do simulation on characters. And this is again a topic I'm going to talk about in far more detail later. So I'll just show you a slide or two about it. But suffice to say, when you have a stadium like this, like we did in the film Cars, you're not going to animate each character by hand. You need some tricks to get them done. And these could be anything from finite state machines, like used in video games, or more artificial intelligence, like schemes, using techniques like fuzzy logic. So I won't go over too much, but suffice to say, there's lots of techniques for simulating crowds. And in the second day of this course, I'm going to focus a lot about the various techniques we used for these films. Because again, this is my specialty. I do a lot with crowds, but that's just one type of set. Now what we're seeing here shows a lot about how to make crowds move. But another challenge of crowd simulation is how to render that many crowds. Because for those of you that have done 3D before, you'll know it doesn't take much to create a scene that takes way too long to render, and you'll never finish your project. Crowds, you can have upwards of 100,000 or even 1 million in some shots. So we often come up with tricks to render them efficiently. One cool trick I just wanted to show you guys, something we call shrink wrapping, where we'll take a cube and displace it to look like a car. So the car is actually just a cube, but the shader itself reads textures that were measured from the distance between the cube and the original car, and they can actually push the points into place at render time. And this is useful because the original car might be 30,000, 40,000 polygons, maybe 100,000 if the modeler was too zealous. And that displaced cube is only 8 points in memory. The rest of it could be sort of streamed dynamically at render time. Basically, textures are far cheaper than polygons. So that sort of technique allowed us to render 100,000 cars in a single shot on Cars and Cars 2. So that's the other side of crowds, is the simulation aspect. All right, so we're getting to the end of the pipeline here. Once all the simulation is done, finally we can start doing lighting. And I'll show you some shots. I'll take the volume off. We don't really. But these shots from cars really illustrate the complexity of lighting. Where lighting, until now we've had materials, we've had moving character and effects, but lighting creates all the shadows and reflections, basically does, and also the composition. Where should be the viewer looking? Now, again, to show you what it looks like, here's a shot that's not lit, and that's with lighting. And I'll go through a couple of these. Again, without lighting, with lighting. Really changes where the viewer is looking. It also is quite a bit of work to figure out how you go from something that's flat and candlelit to a beautiful composition. You can think of it like taking a photograph with flash versus taking a shot without flash. We don't use flash. We don't just have a single light in the camera. We have to figure out where the sun is, where the light fog is, and tune the parameters to look believable and also be noise-free, which, as many of you know, some of these techniques can be very expensive and very noisy. Lighters have to figure out how to get it more efficiently. A lot of it is looking at that reference that we used from art. All right, so once lighting is done, we have to render it. That's what is called a render farm. It's probably, I think we have upwards of 8,000 to 10,000 CPUs right now. I think we have about 24 cores in each machine. So, it's only about, all right, we'll have hundreds and hundreds of computers, each with many processors in it. And we use those to do all that lighting and rendering. And it's quite a lot of work. And I'm going to talk, this is the second half today. I'm going to talk a lot about how rendering works, why you need this many computers, and how you can potentially avoid needing this many computers. Because, believe it or not, we don't just buy our way out of a rendering problem. It is still very hard to render the scenes we have. So even with this many computers, we do have TDs that are dedicated specifically to making rendering fast and making sure we get overnight all the frames through that we need. So we do have a lot of rendering TDs. In fact, we have a department called RPG, which is called the Render Pipeline Group, that is dedicated to maintaining that render farm, making sure we get full utilization. It's kind of similar to being a system administrator. If the network is slow, who are you going to go to? At Pixar, it's the Render Pipeline Group. You might say, why is my render so slow? The Render Pipeline Group can figure out if anything's going wrong and also make sure ahead of time that things aren't going wrong. And our render farm has that lovely sign outside of it. So rendering will go shot by shot after lighting is done. Creates all of the different images, and they create the final frames. However, we also have post-production, like any other studio, where we do a final color grading pass, where we get sound effects in there, and make sure it prints out the 35mm film correctly. So that's very traditional. So, that was a lot to go through. That is essentially Pixar's pipeline. Let's see, it took me about 90 minutes there to go through. So I think this is a good time to have questions and potentially take a little break before we get to the next part. So, with that, where we're going again is we're going to focus more on rendering. Now that we've kind of gone over the whole Pixar pipeline, does anyone have questions about what we've covered?
Do you find yourself learning more and becoming more efficient with every movie that you do?
Yeah, Pixar has kind of grown up with the industry, so we certainly make plenty of mistakes and learn quite a bit of new things. One thing I like to say is no one has retired from this industry yet. The founder of the company, Ed Catmull, he's still working. This is a very young industry. We're clearly going to learn a lot, and you'll see that a bit in the next presentation, all the lessons we've learned in rendering. And one of the things that causes us to learn new things is technology changes all the time. As computers get faster, things we would never do in the past now become viable, and we have a way, we want to think about ways to incorporate it. So, yeah, because technology is getting better, we think about new workflows that were once not possible, that now maybe we can finally do. So yeah, quite a bit gets learned along the way. Any other questions?
How did you get started into this industry?
How did I get started? Yeah, so I was guess when I was still in high school, junior high, I played too many video games, and particular games like Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII maybe, I really liked the cinematics, the 3D there, and I kind of wanted to, work out. I love that 3D imagery so much. I sort of wanted to create some of my own. So I looked for various, programs and colleges that taught computer graphics. Eventually, I found one at the University of Pennsylvania called Digital Media Design that taught computer science as well as art and computer graphics. And from there, I worked very hard. I worked in some labs, working with the computer graphics researchers as well as in some completely unrelated industries. But eventually I got an internship at Pixar as a junior, and it was 6 months, and that turned into a full-time offer. So then I went back to school and got there. So I'm lucky in that, in school, I was able to get an internship. And often, the road to Pixar, you either get an internship or residency, either in school or graduating, or you work in the industry a long time and become a rock star, and then kind of join. So I was lucky to have joined right out of school. But suffice to say, I'd been studying computer graphics for a while. So I'm trying to think what impressed them. It might be because that was around when the film Cars was coming out, and I was working on shading quite a bit. In particular, how to make car paint look realistic. So I think I was doing the right thing at the right time, potentially, to get a foot in the door. Any other questions?
Excuse me, I would like to know the Pixar has working process animate before barrel recording or editing.
So we typically do recording first for final.